Rosaria Mendez was 42 years old and carried on her face the silent mark of someone who learned early on that life does not usually ask permission before changing everything. She grew up in Jardim Angela, in the south zone of São Paulo, in a 3-room house that her mother kept clean with the same stubbornness with which she resisted difficulties. When her mother passed away a few years ago, she left Rosaria not only the house, but also the deepest responsibility of her life, caring for Renato, her older brother, who at 48 lived with moderate cerebral palsy and depended on help for almost everything. Rosaria never complained about it, not because she didn't feel the weight, but because Renato was the reason she woke up every day with the will to fight. He had a smile capable of lighting up any room, liked to listen to sertanejo at the highest volume the neighborhood would tolerate, and called his sister Rosinha with a tenderness that disarmed any sadness. The problem was that his wheelchair was old, creaking at the joints, and the specialists consulted at the health clinic were clear. He needed an adapted, ergonomic chair with correct postural support. The recommended model cost almost 4,000 reais. For Rosaria, who worked as a daily cleaner in 3 different houses during the week, that amount seemed as distant as a star. It was on a Tuesday morning, while she waited for the bus on Avenida Juan Diaz with aching feet and her bag of cleaning supplies on her lap, that she received a call from Dona Conceição, her neighbor who worked for a referral service for domestic workers for high-standard families. The woman's voice sounded excited on the other end of the line. Rosaria, an opening appeared in Perdizes. Big house, difficult boss, but the salary is the best I've ever seen pass through my hands. Are you in? She didn't ask for details about the difficult boss. She asked when it started. The mansion was on a tree-lined street between Perdizes and Pompeia, discreet on the outside, imposing on the inside. 3 floors, a side garden, a 4-car garage, and a heavy silence that Rosaria felt even on the sidewalk, before even ringing the bell. A middle-aged woman, introduced as Helena, the housekeeper, received her at the entrance and explained the rules with the precision of someone who had repeated them to many candidates before. Mr. Eduardo had an accident 4 months ago. Lumbar spine fracture. He uses a wheelchair for an indefinite period. He lives here alone. The family comes eventually. Your job is to take care of the house, the meals, and general organization. You must not ask personal questions. You must not comment on the chair. You must not offer help unless he asks. And he rarely asks. Rosaria nodded, memorizing everything. He is in the office on the 2nd floor. He will want to speak with you before deciding. The staircase was made of white marble with a golden handrail. Rosaria went up carefully, holding her bag close to her body, conscious of every noise her shoes made on the steps. The office had dark wood walls, shelves with books and trophies, and a wide desk behind which Eduardo Cavalcanti watched her enter without saying a word. He was 51 years old and his hair was starting to silver at the temples. He would have been a man of imposing posture. That was visible in his broad shoulders and firm chin, but there was something constricted about him, a constant tension like that of someone who is always on the defensive. The wheelchair seemed to irritate him just by existing. He didn't offer a greeting, he just looked. Do you know how to really cook, or just those disguised delivery things? Rosaria didn't blink. I know how to make real food, yes. Beans from scratch, meat at the right point, fluffy rice. If you want something more elaborate, tell me in advance and I'll research the recipe. He studied her face for a few seconds. Helena said the last employee stayed 3 weeks, the one before 2. Do you think you will last longer? I don't know, sir. It depends on what you do to make me leave. The silence that followed was dense. Rosaria didn't look away. Eduardo Cavalcanti drummed his fingers on the table in a slow, calculated rhythm. You start tomorrow, 6 in the morning. Don't be late. She returned home that afternoon with her heart beating in a different way, between relief and apprehension. She sat next to Renato in the living room, put her hand in his, and said in a firm voice that things were going to get better. He smiled in his own way, with his head slightly tilted and his eyes shining, and asked if she had bought Brigadeiro. Rosaria laughed and promised she would buy it soon. That night, while she prepared her clothes for the next day, she thought about Eduardo Cavalcanti's gaze. In that dark office, with all that wealth around, there was something she recognized without knowing how to name it yet. It was the same look of someone who carries a pain they cannot put into words, and therefore prefers to put it into harshness. Rosaria knew that look. She had used it herself for a while after her ex-husband left, unable to understand that caring for Renato was not a burden, but a choice of love. It took time to exchange that look for another, firmer, cleaner. Perhaps the difficult boss hadn't yet discovered how to do that. She turned off the bedroom light and closed her eyes. Tomorrow would be the first day, and Rosaria Mendez had never been late anywhere in her life. The alarm clock rang at 4:40 in the morning. She was already awake. The first days at the Perdizi's mansion were a silent negotiation between two prides. Rosaria arrived punctually at 6, prepared breakfast according to the instructions left by Helena on a laminated list on the refrigerator, and left the tray on the dining room table before Eduardo came down via the adapted elevator, installed between the first and second floors. He never thanked her. She never expected it. The house was too big for one person. Rosaria spent her days cleaning rooms that seemed not to have been used for months, organizing well-stocked pantries that never lost items because no one consumed them, and feeling the weight of that silence that was not peace, but absence. There were photos on the hallway walls, records of a life before the accident. Eduardo standing in a suit at a corporate ceremony. A young Eduardo on a sailboat, laughing with his eyes squinted against the sun. Eduardo with an elegant woman whom Rosaria could not name, both in formal attire. None of those photos had been taken by someone who truly loved him, she sensed, without knowing how to explain where that certainty came from. In the first week, the biggest challenge was not the work itself, but learning to occupy the space without being noticed, and at the same time being efficient enough so that Eduardo would find no reason for complaint. He was demanding in a way that seemed less like preference and more like control. The towels folded in a specific way, the books replaced on the shelf in the exact order they were in. The coffee strong, without sugar, served at a maximum of 60 degrees. Rosaria memorized everything without writing it down. It was on the Thursday of the second week that they had their first real conflict. She was reorganizing the living room when she noticed that one of the front wheels of Eduardo's chair had visibly less pressure, slightly flattened on one side. Without thinking twice, she went to get the manual air pump she had seen in the garage and returned to the living room. "Will you let me check the wheel pressure? It's a bit flat on the left side." Eduardo turned his head slowly, as if the question had violated an invisible border. "Do not touch the chair." "But it will cause wear on the axle if—" "I said do not touch the chair." The voice was low and precise, without shouting, but with a weight intended to end any continuation. Rosaria rested the air pump on the floor, nodded once, and went back to what she was doing. Inside, she felt a hot irritation that she knew well, the same one she felt when she had to swallow absurdity to maintain what was necessary. 2 hours later, when she was in the kitchen cutting onions for lunch, she heard a sharp noise coming from the living room. She waited 3 seconds, then went to see. Eduardo was stopped in the middle of the room, looking at the front left wheel, now visibly flatter. He said nothing when he saw her appear at the door. She didn't say anything either. She picked up the air pump, knelt beside the wheel, and calibrated it in silence. When she finished, she stood up, put away the equipment, and went back to the kitchen. Neither of them mentioned the episode. But the following week, when she arrived in the morning, she found a small notebook on the kitchen counter with a list of preventive maintenance items for the chair. Beside it, a handwritten note that said only, "Check weekly." Rosaria put the notebook in the drawer and did not comment. But that night, on the bus back to Jardimangela, she allowed herself a small private smile. With time, the routine gained a different texture. Eduardo sometimes remained in the reading room in the afternoon, and Rosaria would work in the adjacent rooms. Eventually, the silence between them began to have a distinct quality, less hostile, more accustomed. He read, she cleaned. The clock in the room marked the hours without either of them needing to say anything. But there were days when the tension returned, punctual and specific. Every time someone from Eduardo's family called, the energy of the house changed. He answered the calls in the office with the door closed, and Rosaria could hear, even without wanting to, the restrained tone of someone who is defending themselves without having the strength to do so. Once she heard a woman's name, Fernanda, repeated 3 times in the same sentence, with an inflection she could not classify. She didn't ask. It wasn't her part. On a rainy Friday at the end of the month, Helena appeared at the mansion for a routine visit and talked to Rosaria in the kitchen while Eduardo was resting. "You are lasting longer than the others," the housekeeper commented, with something between admiration and curiosity. "I do my job," Rosaria answered simply. "He hasn't been easy since the accident. Before it was different." Helena paused as if measuring how much she should say. "He was a very active man. He founded the company from scratch, traveled the whole world, never stayed still. The accident was on a private flight, very strong turbulence. He fell inside the aircraft and fractured 2 vertebrae. The doctors said there could be recovery, but it takes time and requires constant physical therapy. He interrupted the sessions 2 months ago." Rosaria processed the information, but did not comment. She kept everything in the right place within herself and continued peeling the yam for dinner. That night, before closing the house and leaving, she passed through the room where Eduardo was, with an open book on his lap and a lost gaze beyond the pages. She asked if he needed anything before she left. He said no. But when she was already at the door, she heard his voice, lower than usual. "Do you know how to cook sugar cane juice with ginger?" Rosaria turned with a neutral expression. "I do. My mother used to make it in the winter." "Make it tomorrow." She nodded and left. Outside, the rain was still falling on the wet stones of the street, and Rosaria walked to the bus stop thinking that sometimes the smallest of concessions is the beginning of a change that doesn't have a name yet. It was on a July morning, when the São Paulo cold descended through the streets with that thick humidity that seems to seep through your coat, that everything changed inside the Perdizes mansion. Rosaria arrived at 6 sharp, as always. She prepared the coffee, warmed the bread, cut the papaya into uniform slices, but when she called Eduardo for breakfast, she got no response. She called again. Silence. She climbed the stairs cautiously and knocked twice on the bedroom door. Nothing. She pushed the door open and found Eduardo on the floor. He had tried to transfer himself alone from the bed to the wheelchair during the night, as he sometimes did when pride was greater than common sense, and he had slipped. He was lying on his side on the rug, conscious, but with a pale face and dry lips. There was a slight tremor in his shoulders that he was clearly trying to control. "No need to call anyone," he said even before she could open her mouth. The voice was firm, but there was something she recognized as effort behind it. "I understand," Rosaria replied calmly, kneeling beside him. "I'm going to help you up. Tell me if you are in pain." "I'm fine." "With you lying on the floor at 6 in the morning?" "I'm fine" is not a sufficient answer. He didn't answer. But when she positioned her arm to support him, he didn't push her away. Rosaria worked slowly, firmly, guiding the man's weight back to the bed with the method she had learned caring for Renato over the years. It wasn't brute force. It was technique, balance, and patience. Eduardo cooperated without saying a word, and when he finally sat on the edge of the bed, she saw that there was sweat on his forehead. "You need to resume physical therapy," she said while adjusting the pillows. "That is none of your business. With you calling me to pick you up off the floor in the middle of the night, it will be." He turned his face to the side. She didn't insist further. She fetched the chair, positioned it correctly, and helped with the transfer without ceremony, as if it were just another one of the day's tasks. Eduardo didn't thank her, but he didn't complain either. 3 days later, he woke up with a fever. Rosaria noticed even before getting close, just by the way he was in the chair, slightly hunched, his eyes with that characteristic opacity. She checked the temperature. 38.8. She called Helena, who called Eduardo's doctor, who prescribed rest, hydration, and antipyretics every 4 hours. The problem was that Eduardo, with or without a fever, refused to accept any form of help beyond the absolutely inevitable. It was in this context that the moment neither of them expected happened, and it would change the weight of the air between them forever. On the afternoon of that same day, Eduardo called Rosaria with a voice raspier than usual. She appeared at the door of the adapted bathroom, which was on the upper floor next to his bedroom. He was in the chair, looking at the bathtub with a look that took her a second to decipher. Then she understood. "I can't do it alone today," he said, and there was something in his voice she had never heard there before. It wasn't a request, it was an admission. Rosaria didn't look surprised. She didn't comment. She only asked what temperature he preferred for the water, went to the faucet, and adjusted it while he remained silent. Then she helped with the transfer to the adapted bench inside the shower stall, handed him the sponge and soap without words, kept her back turned while he managed, and when he could no longer manage, she helped with the same practical efficiency and the same silent respect with which she did everything. There was no sentimentality. There was no displayed embarrassment. She treated that moment with the seriousness of someone who understands that the human body in vulnerability is not a cause for shame, but for care. When she finished and Eduardo was back in the chair, covered with a towel, she said she would prepare a soup and would leave the medication on the bedside table. She turned to leave. "Rosaria." She stopped at the door without turning around. "Thank you." She nodded once and went to the kitchen, but while she was cutting the carrots for the soup, her hands stopped for a moment over the board. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds, not out of sadness nor joy, out of something harder to name, the recognition that there was something genuine in that man beneath all that armor, and that she, without planning to, had touched it. In the following days, something changed in the dynamics of the house. Eduardo began to answer her questions with more than monosyllables. One afternoon, when she was mopping the reading room, he commented on the book he was reading, a biography of a São Paulo engineer from the beginning of the last century, and she listened with genuine attention. He seemed surprised by this. "Do you read?" he asked, in that direct way that no longer sounded like a provocation. "I read when I have time. I like history, real life. Romance bores me." He made a sound that could have been agreement or a suppressed laugh. Rosaria couldn't tell, but she kept the moment anyway. That week, she also noticed that he had resumed his rehabilitation exercises alone, without announcing it, using the equipment that had been dusty in a corner of the room for months. She didn't comment. She only ensured that the space around the equipment was always clean and unobstructed. September arrived with that humid heat, typical of the São Paulo spring, when the city seems to breathe with a different breath after the winter. The coexistence between Rosaria and Eduardo had acquired a regularity that, without either of them completely noticing, had the marks of something closer to a partnership than a work relationship. He had resumed physical therapy sessions, now 3 times a week, with a professional who came to the mansion. Rosaria organized the exercise room before each session and prepared the orange juice with turmeric that the physical therapist had recommended. Eduardo never explicitly asked for this. She simply did it, and he simply drank it, and the two of them pretended that it meant nothing more than what it was. But there were moments when the boundary between what was work and what was genuine care became less clear. On a Tuesday afternoon, Rosaria was in the kitchen when her personal phone rang. It was the caregiver who stayed with Renato during the day, a woman named Graça, who worked part-time in exchange for an amount Rosaria could barely maintain. Graça's voice was agitated. "Rosaria, he had a crisis. He's breathing," but he got very agitated, started shaking his right arm hard, and then became confused, disoriented. "I called Samu. They are on their way. Can you come?" Rosaria hung up the phone with a cold hand. She entered the room where Eduardo was working on his laptop and said objectively that she had to leave, that it was urgent, that she would explain later. She didn't wait for authorization. She grabbed her bag, her coat, and left. The trip from Perdizes to Jardimangela took almost an hour in the afternoon traffic. She arrived when Renato was already stable, lying in bed, with a tired but recognizable look. He saw her enter and stretched his hand toward her. Rosaria held that hand and sat beside him for a long time, saying nothing, listening to her brother's breathing regularize. The next morning, she arrived at the mansion 40 minutes late. Eduardo was in the dining room with untouched coffee in front of him. He looked at her when she entered, but said nothing immediately. "Sorry, I'm late," she said, going straight to the kitchen. "Where did you go yesterday?" The voice was that same one as always, direct, without tone, but there was something behind it that she couldn't read in time. I had a personal emergency. There were things to be done here too. Rosaria stopped. She turned slowly. I know. And I apologize for the absence. But there was no way to stay. If you can't keep the hours, I need to know in advance. Something inside Rosaria became firm as stone. When my brother gets sick, I have no way to predict it in advance. That is not my problem. She nodded once slowly and went back to the kitchen. Inside she felt something tighten in her chest, not out of fear, but out of a cold hurt she knew, that of realizing that, for certain people, you are just a function within a house, not a human being with a life of your own. That afternoon, Eduardo called her to the office. It's not going to work. I need someone available and reliable. You are fired. Rosaria stood in front of his desk for 3 seconds of absolute silence. Then something she had held back for weeks finally found a way out. Then I will leave. But first, you are going to listen. My brother has cerebral palsy. I have cared for him alone since our mother left. The husband I had couldn't bear this reality and disappeared without warning, without saying goodbye, leaving a 2-line letter on a kitchen table. I have no support family. I have no safety net. I have myself, a caregiver who works part-time because that's all I can afford, and the salary I receive here, which is the best I've ever had in my life. When you fired me yesterday without hearing a word, you weren't firing a negligent employee. You were firing a person who ran to save the only being in the world who depends on her. If that doesn't work for you, fine. But you needed to know. Eduardo sat motionless in his chair. Rosaria grabbed her bag, walked to the door and went down the stairs without looking back. She arrived home in the early evening and sat on the porch for a while, looking at the street without seeing it. Renato was sleeping. The house was quiet. She did a quick calculation in her head of what she had saved, how long she could last without a new income, and the result was not comfortable. 3 days later, when she had already started calling old clients asking for more cleaning days, the phone rang, a number she recognized. She answered. "This is Eduardo Cavalcanti. I want you to come back." A pause. "It won't be like it was before," he continued, and his voice had a different texture, rougher but in another way, like someone making an effort. "You will have a flexible departure time on the days you need it, and your salary increases by 20% starting next week." Rosaria looked at the ceiling of the living room. "Why are you doing this?" The answer took a moment. "Because I behaved like an idiot, and because no one here cooks like you." She almost laughed. Almost. "Monday, 6 in the morning," she said, and she hung up. Rosaria returned on a Monday with a container of feijão tropeiro she had made at home on Sunday, because she knew the mansion's pantry was unstocked and that Eduardo probably hadn't ordered any delivery during the 3 days of her absence. When she walked through the kitchen door and opened the refrigerator, she found exactly what she expected, almost nothing. He was in the office. She prepared the coffee, heated the feijão tropeiro in the skillet with a drizzle of olive oil, made scrambled eggs, and put everything on the table without announcing it. 10 minutes later, she heard the elevator descend. Eduardo entered the dining room, looked at the table and stood still for a second. "You brought food from home?" "You had nothing here, sir." He sat down without further comment. He ate in silence, but she saw him go to the container of feijão tropeiro twice, and that was enough. The following days had a different quality from everything that had existed before. The confrontation had opened something between them, like when you force a window stuck by humidity and the air finally circulates. They still maintained the formal distance of boss and employee, but there were gaps in that formality, moments when she appeared more naturally. He began to appear more frequently in the kitchen during meal preparation, not to supervise but to stay. He would get a coffee, stay in the chair beside the central island, and sometimes comment on something. About business, about a news item he had read, about a logistics problem at the company that irritated him. Rosaria answered when she had something to say and stayed silent when she didn't. He seemed to appreciate exactly that. "Most people I know talk just to fill space," he said one afternoon, almost without looking at her. "I learned from my mother that good silence is a sign of respect," she replied, without stopping chopping the garlic. He was quiet for a moment and then said, more to himself than to her, "I should have learned that before I got married." Rosaria didn't ask, but he continued anyway, as if the memory had found an exit through that crack. It was 7 years. She was beautiful, intelligent, circulated well at events, knew exactly what to say to each person. She just didn't know what to say to me. When the accident happened, she stayed 3 weeks. Then she packed her bags and said she hadn't married that version of me. The silence that followed had the weight of a real thing. "Did she say that with those words?" Rosaria asked, lower. "Almost. She said I had changed and that she couldn't keep up. But the meaning was the same." Rosaria rested the knife on the board for a moment. "Do you think she was wrong?" Eduardo looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately catalogue. "I don't understand the question. You did change. The accident changed you. It would be honest of her to say no. The question is whether she was wrong to leave when you needed her most." The question hung in the air between them for a long moment. He turned the chair slightly to the side, looking through the kitchen window at the dark green garden of September. "Yes, she was wrong in that." Rosaria nodded, as if the answer confirmed something she already knew, and went back to the garlic. During that same period, she began to notice that Eduardo's family appeared more frequently. His mother, Donna Beatrice, a woman with light hair and discreet jewelry that spoke louder than she did, came twice that month. She treated Rosaria with that icy courtesy of someone who is educated by training, not by temperament. She never called her by name. She always said, "young lady," or the employee. On one of the visits, Rosaria was arranging the pots on the porch when she heard Donna Beatriz in the office. "Eduardo, Fernanda asked about you. She wants to have lunch with you next week." "I'm not interested. She is an excellent woman from our family of lifelong friends, and she understands—" "I said I'm not interested, Mother." A pause. "You are spending too much time with the maid. People talk." "People have nothing to do." Rosaria continued arranging the pots, as if she hadn't heard anything, but there was an involuntary heat in her face that she had to control with effort. That afternoon, before leaving, she stopped at the door of the room where Eduardo was and said, with the naturalness of someone commenting on the weather, "Tomorrow I'm going to leave early if you allow. My brother has an appointment at the rehabilitation center. I want to go with him." "What time?" "At 3. "All right." She left, but as she walked down the street toward the bus stop, she realized there was something different in the way he had said, "all right." It wasn't authorization, it was consideration, and the difference between the two things, in that life she had built alone brick by brick, meant more than any salary. The event was announced by Donna Beatriz as just a business dinner with the company's closest partners. But when Rosaria arrived at the mansion on that Saturday morning and saw the catering team setting up tables with dishes that were worth more than a month of her salary, she understood that business dinner was a generous way to describe what was being prepared. Eduardo had mentioned the event the day before, with the discretion of someone who doesn't consider the matter important enough for details. He said only that there would be guests in the evening and that he needed the house to be impeccable. Rosaria organized everything with her usual silent competence, coordinating with the catering team, checking the space, ensuring that the hallways were free for the movement of the chair. Donna Beatriz arrived in the early afternoon to supervise what she called the final adjustments, which in practice meant walking through the rooms with a glass of mineral water and issuing opinions on the positioning of every object. When she crossed paths with Rosaria in the hallway and saw that she was carrying a vase of flowers for the entrance sideboard, she stopped. "Those flowers don't match the environment. Use the white ones that are in the pantry." "The white ones are wilted. These were bought this morning." "Then someone should have bought fresh white ones." Donna Beatriz moved on without further comment. Rosaria breathed, placed the red flowers on the sideboard, and went to get what she needed for the next task. At night, when the guests began to arrive, she stayed in the kitchen helping the caterers with whatever was necessary. It wasn't planned for her to remain during the event, but the head of the catering team asked for help with a last-minute problem with the mansion's adapted oven, and she stayed. That was how she was in the back hallway when she heard the voice. Female, clear, with that diction of someone who grew up in private schools and did an exchange program in Europe. and what she said was directed to another woman, but at a volume that wasn't very concerned about not being heard. "Did you see that he brought the maid to circulate through the event? She was in the main hallway just now, completely out of place. Poor Eduardo. After the accident, the family lets anyone get close." A discreet laugh. The second woman, whom Rosaria did not see, answered something she didn't quite understand. "It's obvious she's taking advantage of the situation. That kind of woman always takes advantage." The voice continued. "Fernanda, you need to resume this with him. You are the only suitable person to be by his side." Rosaria stood still for a second. Then she walked back to the kitchen with steady steps, as if she hadn't heard anything, as if her chest didn't have that familiar tightness she knew from the time the neighbors commented on her life after her marriage ended. She finished what she needed to do, told the catering head she was leaving, and went to get her bag from the service room. When she was leaving through the back door, she heard Eduardo's voice behind her. "Rosaria." She stopped. She turned. He had reached there alone, the chair moving silently through the wide hallway. There was something in his expression she hadn't seen before, a direct attention that didn't try to hide what it was. "Are you leaving?" "I've already finished what I needed to do here." He looked at her for a moment. "What happened?" "Nothing. Good night, Mr. Eduardo." "Rosaria." The way he said her name, not as an order but as an appeal, made her stop a second time. "I heard," he said lower. "I was close enough. I didn't need the whole sentence to understand." She didn't answer immediately. The night entered through the open window of the hallway with that smell of jasmine from the garden she had learned to recognize over the months. "Don't worry about it," she said finally. "It's not the first time someone has seen me that way. It won't be the last. That doesn't make it acceptable." "No, but it's real, and I know how to deal with what is real." She left before he could say anything else. On the subway back home, with her hands on her lap and the noise of the tracks filling the silence, she stared at her own reflection in the dark window of the carriage. There was something in that expression of Eduardo's that she needed to stop thinking about, not because it was dangerous, but because it was the kind of thing a woman in her position couldn't afford to let grow without first understanding what it really was, and what was just the loneliness of two strangers who spent too much time in the same space. When she got home, Renato was awake, waiting for her with a biscuit in his outstretched hand. She sat next to him, accepted the biscuit, rested her head lightly on his shoulder, and stayed quiet. He placed his hand on her head with that particular delicacy that only he had. Outside, São Paulo continued its noisy, indifferent night. But there, in that small room with the silent television and the smell of biscuits in the air, Rosaria remembered who she was and why she fought, and that was enough for the moment. November arrived with those quick storms that the city suddenly throws in the middle of the afternoon, soaking the streets before anyone has time to open an umbrella. Rosaria had gotten used to this rhythm, just as she had gotten used to many things that at first seemed too difficult. 2 weeks had passed since the event. The routine at the mansion continued almost the same on the outside, but there was something different on the inside. Eduardo was more present, more direct in conversations, less defensive. The doctors had confirmed that recovery was progressing well, and that if the current pace of physical therapy was maintained, there was a real prospect of him walking again with support within a few months. When Rosaria heard this from Helena, she felt a genuine relief that surprised her with its intensity. It was on a Wednesday afternoon that Renato received the wheelchair. Rosaria was at the mansion when she received the message from Graça. A large box had arrived at the house, addressed to Renato Mendes, with a note that said only, "so that he may go far." No sender, no signature. She reread the message 3 times. Then she went to Eduardo's office. He was on the phone. When he saw her enter, he ended the call. She placed the phone with Graça's message on the table in front of him and stood still. "Was it you, sir?" Eduardo didn't answer immediately. He looked at the table, not at her. The chair the doctor recommended was that one, right? The one with lateral postural support. "How did you know which one it was?" "You left the medical recommendation paper in the kitchen drawer 2 months ago." "I read it." Rosaria was silent. There was a knot in her chest she was unable to undo. "Why did you do this?" He finally looked at her. "Because I could. and because it was right. The simplicity of the answer was almost impossible to contest, but there was something there she needed to understand before knowing what to do with it. "You didn't need to." "I know I didn't need to." The voice was quiet, without drama. "But you have worked here for months, and I never asked your brother's name. I never asked what he needed. I was so busy with my own wheelchair that I didn't see the others." Rosaria closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, there was a dampness there that she didn't let turn into a tear, because it wasn't the moment, and because the crying would come later, at home, alone, the way she always processed big things. "His name is Renato," she said, "and he will love it." Eduardo nodded once, with that restraint she had learned to recognize as the most honest version of him. "Feel free to leave early today if you want to see him receive it." She went. She arrived home still in the late afternoon, when the November sun still had color. Graça had partially assembled the chair, and Renato was sitting in it with a huge smile, clapping his hands in an irregular and joyful way. The chair had the colors he had chosen in the catalogue she had kept as a promise, blue with silver details. Rosaria stood at the door for a second before entering. Then she hugged her brother with that specific strength of someone who finally managed to deliver something she had been holding for a long time. "New chair, Rosina," he said proudly. "New chair, Renato." In the weeks that followed, Rosaria noticed that gratitude had created something different in the space between her and Eduardo. It wasn't discomfort, nor obligation. It was a new awareness, that there was a real bond there, built without anyone having planned it. He began to ask questions about Renato naturally, how the treatment was going, if the crises had decreased, what he liked to eat. She answered with the same naturalness, and there was something almost impossible to describe in those conversations in the kitchen, two different worlds finding common vocabulary. But there was a tension that grew along with all of this, the awareness that feelings do not ask permission before appearing. Rosaria perceived it in small gestures, the way he stayed a little closer than necessary, when she showed him something on the tablet to look for a recipe, the way he sometimes paused a sentence in the middle, as if what he was about to say needed more care than usual. She knew what that was, and she also knew what the abyss between her life and his represented. One night, when she was preparing to leave, he said, without preamble, "Renato could come here on Saturday. The garden is big, he could use the chair outside." Rosaria stopped with her bag on her shoulder. "Why?" "Because it would be good for him, and because I would like to meet him." She was silent for a moment. Then she said, "I'll ask him." Renato accepted with enthusiasm before she even finished the sentence. The Saturday Renato visited the Perdiz's mansion would be remembered by Rosaria as one of the simplest and fullest days at the same time. She arrived earlier to organize the side garden, ensure the path was accessible for both chairs, and prepare a breakfast that tasted like a special day without seeming forced. Eduardo was on the porch when she arrived, with a coffee in his hands and that expression of someone who slept little, but well. "What time are they coming?" he asked. 9:30. He nodded. There was no anxiety in his words, but there was something in his shoulders that Rosaria recognized as someone who is paying more attention to their own behavior than usual. Renato arrived in Graça's car, who also came. When he got down to the sidewalk with the blue and silver chair, he looked at the facade of the mansion with wide eyes and said very loudly, "Rosina, this house is a soap opera." Eduardo was at the entrance. When he heard this, he made that sound that Rosaria finally managed to classify after months. It was a suppressed laugh that he never let finish, but that always started in his eyes. "You must be Renato," he said. "And you are Rosina's boss," Renato replied with that disarming frankness that made it impossible not to smile. "You can call me Eduardo." Eduardo from the dark office. Rosaria closed her eyes for a second. Eduardo looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. "That's the one," he replied. The day unfolded, with a lightness that none of the adults had planned, but that Renato created simply by being who he was. He explored the garden with the new chair, commented on every plant by a name he invented on the spot, asked to see the machine elevator on the second floor 3 times, and at lunch ate 2 plates of the chicken Rosaria had prepared, While explaining to Eduardo with technical details he created himself how the television in his house worked. Eduardo listened with an attention Rosaria recognized as genuine. It wasn't tolerance. It was real interest. In the afternoon, when Renato was in the garden with Grasa, Eduardo and Rosaria stayed on the porch in silence, the kind of silence she had already learned to distinguish. This was the one that precedes an important speech. "Are you going to stay in this job forever?" he asked without looking at her. She didn't answer immediately. "I don't know, as long as it makes sense. And when it stops making sense, I will leave without much warning." He turned his head and looked at her in a way she had avoided for months, direct, without the usual armor. "I'm afraid of that," he said. The honesty in those words was of a kind that completely disarmed her. She looked at the garden where Renato was laughing at something Grasa had said. "Eduardo," she began with the careful voice of someone who knows that what comes next needs to be said clearly. "We are very different people. Your life and mine don't fit together the same way. I know that. And even so, I can't stop thinking that you are the only person I can be with without needing to pretend I'm fine when I'm not." The garden was quiet. The November sun went down slowly. Rosaria kept those words inside her chest without knowing yet what to do with them. She left that afternoon without giving an answer, and Eduardo didn't ask for one. But when Renato said goodbye at the entrance, he shook the hand of the man in the chair with that firm, crooked grip that was characteristic of him and said, "Come back to my house to drink sugarcane juice." Eduardo looked at Rosaria for a second before answering her brother. "I will, yes." In the following days, Rosaria worked with that thing growing in her chest that she didn't name, but that changed the way of every morning. She caught herself doing small and specific things, choosing his breakfast with more attention, leaving a window slightly open, because she knew he liked the sound of rain when it rained, putting on the kitchen radio, that station of instrumental jazz she had discovered he preferred but never asked for. And then came the revelation that changed everything. One afternoon, while organizing documents in the file room at Eduardo's request, Rosaria found, among papers in an old folder, a bank transfer statement. The date was from 4 weeks ago. The recipient was Renato's full name. The amount covered the exact cost of the wheelchair, and also, she realized upon looking closer, the next 6 months of speech therapy sessions at the rehabilitation center. She had thought the chair was an isolated gesture. She had thanked him for it and moved on. But this was different. Eduardo had researched the treatment, discovered the cost, provided it without saying anything, and moved on with life as if he had done nothing extraordinary. Rosaria stood still with that paper in her hand for a long time. Then she went to the office. He was on the phone. When she entered with the paper in her hand, he ended the call. "You knew I was going to find it," she said. It wasn't a question. "Eventually, yes." "Why didn't you tell me?" He was silent for a moment. "Because I didn't want you to feel in debt. It wasn't for that." "Then what was it for?" "Because I could, and because Renato deserves it." He paused. "And because you taught me something I had forgotten a long time ago." "What thing?" "That caring for someone without expecting anything in return still exists in the world." Rosaria stood in front of the desk with that paper, and there were so many things inside her at that moment that the only way not to lose herself in any of them was to stay absolutely quiet. 2 months later, Eduardo Cavalcanti took his first steps with support in the second-floor hallway of the mansion. They were 5 steps, slow, with the physical therapist on one side and the handrail on the other, but they were real steps. Rosaria was at the end of the hallway, with a tray of juices she had brought for after the session, and when she saw him reach the end of the 5 steps and stop with his chest rising and falling in effort, she said nothing. She only placed the tray on the small hallway table and applauded once slowly. He looked at her, and this time neither of them looked away. The conversation that followed didn't happen that day. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, a week later, when Rosaria had gone to the organic market on Avenida Sumare, because Eduardo had mentioned he wanted to try a new recipe, and when she returned, she found him in the living room, with an expression she recognized as that of someone who had made a decision. "Sit here," he said. She sat on the sofa across from him. "I'm not good at saying certain things," he began. "I learned to talk about business, numbers, strategy. I never properly learned to say what matters. I know that. So you will have to be patient while I try." She waited. "Since you entered this house, things stopped being just silent and started to have meaning again. Not because you make good food or because you take care of the house better than anyone else, but because you are honest in a way that challenges me. You don't let me be less than I need to be, and that is rare. Too rare for me to pretend it doesn't matter." Rosaria looked at her own hands for a moment. "Eduardo, the people in your family, my mother will adapt. She is already adapting, she just doesn't admit it yet. Your world is very different from mine." "Yes, and yours has things that mine never had." He moved the chair an inch forward, just enough to be closer. "I'm not asking you to stop being who you are, I'm asking to be part of what you are." She raised her eyes to him. "And Renato?" she asked. "He has already invited me for sugarcane juice 3 times. I think he is further ahead than we are." Rosaria laughed, a real laugh that started slowly and reached her eyes. It was the first one Eduardo saw completely, without restraint, and he kept looking like someone who is saving something. "I'm afraid," she said, after the laughter subsided. "Me too." "It's not the same kind of fear." "No, but both are real. And it might be exactly because of that that it's worth it." Rosaria was silent for a long moment, looking at that man who had come to her as an obstacle, and who, without either of them having planned it, had become something completely different. She thought of the morning she found him on the bedroom floor, of the bath she had given with seriousness and respect, of the feijão tropeiro she had brought from home, of Renato's blue chair, of the folded paper with the bank transfer. She thought of everything that is built beneath what appears. "I'm going to need you to treat me as an equal," she said finally. "I always have. Sometimes not. Sometimes not." He didn't look away. "But I learned." She reached out her hand slowly, not romantically, but with that seriousness that was Rosaria Mendez's truest language. He placed his hand over hers. And so, in a living room in Perdices, on an ordinary Sunday, with the smell of fruit from the market in the bag and sun coming through the window, 2 very different people discovered that what made them different was exactly what made the encounter between them impossible to forget. Donna Beatriz over time stopped saying the employee and started saying Rosaria. Later, a few months later, she started saying simply she, in the way one speaks of someone who is already part of the place. She never admitted the change out of loud, but Rosaria saw her put away the container of cornmeal cake she had made during a visit with a care that said more than any words. Renato drank the sugarcane juice with Eduardo on a March afternoon in the mansion garden, with sertanejo at the highest volume the neighborhood would tolerate. Eduardo didn't ask to turn it down, and the small homemade food business that Rosaria had started with Grasa's mother continued to grow, now with a larger kitchen, better resources, and a partner who understood management because she had learned in the school of necessity. What had started as a maid hired to take care of a house, and which had ended taking care of much more than that, became a story about what happens when 2 people stop pretending that the world they live in is sufficient as it is. Sometimes destiny enters through the service door. Sometimes what changes an entire life starts with a bath, a fever, and 5 words said in a low voice at the end of a hallway. "Thank you. You were enough." End of story. Dear listeners, we hope that Rosaria and Eduardo's story touched something true within you. If you've made it this far, you know that the stories that stick the most are the ones that speak of life as it really is, imperfect, difficult, surprising, and capable of a beauty that we never see coming. On our channel, we bring narratives like this every day. Stories of overcoming, love, and transformation that show that a person's value is never in the address they occupy, but in the way they choose to love. If this story moved something in you, leave your comment below, tell us what you felt. Subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and share with someone who also needs to hear a beautiful story today. We'll meet in the next narrative. Until then.